you would get would be a reflexive opposition. And certainly in the last 20 years, this response has grown on the right. It's a reflexive opposition to simply perhaps be against something because of who supports it, whether it's the Sierra Club, whether during the Clinton administration it was Bruce Babbitt, during this administration, whether it's being something supported by President Obama or perhaps Jane Lubchenco in the Department of Commerce or Lisa Jackson at EPA. And then increasingly, a corollary to that, the reflexive opposition, as has already been noted, is to deny the existence of a real problem. And while I certainly agree that some environmental problems are overstated or exaggerated, there are real environmental problems. And if they are inconvenient, if they are difficult, if they are hard to reconcile with a philosophy of that prizes free enterprise and limited government, that doesn't make them go away. And what's been needed on the right for quite some time is a willingness to challenge the presumption that if one is in favor of environmental protection, that if one believes that the world around us, our air quality, our water quality, the diversity of species we have on this planet are things that are important, that the only thing we can do to protect them is to expand the size, scope, and power of government. And what I would suggest is needed is, much like we saw in the welfare context, what made welfare reform possible was not merely the practical experience that a lot of states had trying to do things in a different and better way, but also the willingness of those on the right to challenge the notion that the way you tested someone's commitment to the poor was how much of other people's money they were willing to spend. It wasn't until folks on the right were willing to say, how much I'm willing to tax and spend is not the measure of my compassion. Whether or not people are actually helped is a measure of my compassion. And by that measure, the welfare state prior to welfare reform was a dismal failure. It was something that someone with compassion and awareness of how the policies actually operated would have a hard time defending. And I would argue we can actually say something the same about much environmental policy today. That if our goal is protecting the environment, not merely protecting environmental regulation or the Environmental Protection Agency, then we should be eager to see change. If our goal is protecting endangered species, we should focus on protecting species and not be so concerned about whether or not we protect the Endangered Species Act. But what would an alternative look like? And I only have a little bit of time, so I'm going to speak very broadly about that, and hopefully we'll have time for questions where I can go into more detail. Basically, my view of this, what we might call the free market environmental approach to this, is that the dominant problem that we have in the environmental context is not market failure, but generally the failure to have markets. And what I mean by that is the failure to have those institutions upon which markets are based, present and protected in the environmental context. And this isn't I don't think a particularly new or revolutionary insight. It's something that's been made in the past. In fact, it was made by the noted ecologist Garrett Hardin, but generally forgotten by those that tried to heed his counsel. And in his famous essay on the tragedy of the commons, which, as I think we all know, was really the popularization of an idea that had been well documented both in environmental economics, but also even well before that, he noted that open access commons tend to end in tragedy because the incentives faced by each user of an open access resource is to get as much as he or she can and capture those benefits and disperse the costs to everyone else. And Hardin talked about how one approach to dealing with that is mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon, what we typically think of as regulation. But what we tend to forget is that he also noted there's another solution, a solution that where it can be done works, and that is the institution of private property. In that Science article, he pointed out that in those areas where we've been able to have private property, the tragedy of the commons is averted. The problem, as he saw it, and I think the problem still today, is that in many areas it's difficult to think about how we would apply property institutions to environmental resources. But as a general matter, I think that the answers we should be seeking are those that seek to extend property rights, voluntary exchange, and the rule of law to environmental resources. And I say this not just as a theoretical matter, not just because ideologically or otherwise I happen to think that property-based institutions and markets are a good way to expand human liberty and allow individual fulfillment, but also because when we look around the world today, when we look at those areas where environmental problems are greatest, and we compare them with those areas where environmental problems have been best addressed, we look at where resources are being depleted and are running scarce versus those where we see abundance. When we look at things that are well managed and compare them to those that are not, we see a pattern. Those resources that have been most effectively integrated into market institutions are those that we're not running out of, are those that we see becoming more abundant, are those that are sustainable. Those resources that are left out of the cold, that are not integrated and incorporated into market institutions, are those where we have the greatest problems. Let me just give you a few examples. We can look at fisheries around the world. Fisheries have, for much of the last several decades, been one of the world's most serious environmental problems. The most recent NOAA report points out that in some parts of the world, including the United States, there's been some progress. We've seen progress in making fisheries more sustainable in parts of the United States and in countries like Iceland, New Zealand, and parts of Australia and parts of Canada. And what's interesting is when you look at the pattern of where a fishery is doing better, there is a common denominator. It's the adoption of catch shares and property-based management institutions. We look at areas where fish production for human consumption is greatest and where we're least worried about running out. It's in those fisheries where the property rights are most secure, most transferable, most robust. Those fisheries that are having the greatest problems are those that are either left completely out of management or just exclusively managed through political institutions, like some of those off New England, where for political reasons, fisheries policy has refused to move in the proper direction. We can see this in natural resources, most mineral resources, which are non-renewable, which we should have run out of long ago. We, in fact, see the usable supplies of these resources, in most cases, becoming ever more abundant, prices falling. Why? Because they are fully integrated into our market institutions through property rights. We look at species, those species that are domestic in the United States, those species that are domesticated, those species that are non-indigenous and can be owned privately tend to have their populations increasing. Those species around the world or domestically that cannot be integrated into market institutions are those that are threatened most severely. In sub-Saharan Africa, those elephant populations that are managed through what we often refer to as community-based management or appropriate authority, depending on what country you are, but effectively those wildlife populations, those elephant populations that are managed through what we would recognize as property-based institutions are those elephant populations that are stable or increasing. Those that are left out in the cold or that are managed purely politically are those that are in the worst shape. And we could go on. There's net forest growth on private land in the United States. There isn't on federal lands. We see national parks, which I think all of us would recognize as things that are important to us and as a nation, important to us as people, being horribly mismanaged with massive maintenance backlogs, left in a state that no self-respecting private owner, whether corporation or a nonprofit, would ever allow to happen. There was a comment before about, well, what should we allow to happen in Yellowstone? I go to Yellowstone pretty much every year. If you think about the number of miles of paved road, the number of gas stations, the number of hotels, the number of gift shops, the number of boat docks in Yellowstone National Park, it's hard for me to believe that it would be significantly more developed if it was owned by, say, the Yellowstone Coalition instead of the federal government, owned by the Wilderness Society. The one difference I do think you'd get if it was managed by a non-governmental entity is I don't think you would have the horrendous maintenance backlog. You would not have an internal sewage system that threatens park resources. You would not have the degree of human-wildlife conflicts that you get in the park. The challenge that we face, and it's a real challenge, and it's not just a political challenge, it's a daunting policy challenge, is to figure out how to take the successes we've seen in fisheries and with some wildlife species and some other natural resources, and figure out how to apply them to other resources that are more difficult to conceive of being managed through property-based institutions. But if we don't know what the challenge is, if we don't know how to frame the problem, we're not ever going to find a viable solution. So I want to do in my closing minutes, because I know I only have a few minutes left if I'm going to keep within the time that David gave me, is just outline a set of principles that I think should guide policymakers and others in terms of thinking about the sorts of things we could perhaps try and do here and now to improve our approach to environmental policy. And I should say this is a set of environmental principles that at least in one point in time, due to the work of a handful of us that worked on these issues, were embodied in the House Budget Resolution in the mid to late 90s when John Kasich was a Budget Committee chairman and when one of the staffers on the House Budget Committee was a guy named Paul Ryan, who's since gone on to other things. But what are these principles? Well, first, and this is one we've heard a lot about before, but first, do no harm. It should anger and upset all of us that our federal government takes our tax dollars and uses that money to create and subsidize problems that it will then use more of our tax dollars and its coercive regulatory authority to then try and clean up. It was not until late or middle or after the middle of the 20th century, for example, the federal government stopped deliberately subsidizing the destruction of wetlands. Deliberately. It still does it. Now it's a consequence of other policies that have other goals. States and local governments had begun recognizing wetlands' ecological value and trying to protect them through regulation before the federal government had actually stopped making wetland destruction an actual federal policy. If we care about the amount of money our government spends, if we care about the size and scope of government, and we also care about environmental damage, we should force the federal government to first do no harm. And that not only goes for spending programs, it also goes for regulatory programs. Regulatory programs that often, in pursuit of one environmental goal, create other environmental problems. Secondly, we should recognize that environmental problems are only possible if we have the resources and technological innovation capable of solving those problems. And so we need policies that always recognize the importance of not only economic growth, but also technological innovation. I will admit I was disappointed this morning to hear several folks say that it's important to have technological innovation to deal with problems like climate change, but then come up empty when it came to actually identifying specific policies that might do that. And I think there are quite a few we could put on the table. Yes, reducing regulatory barriers are important, but I think we can also recognize that if you have an open access commons like the atmosphere, it will be overused, whether as a sink for carbon or whatever else, and that is a justification for some governmental action. And even if we don't think it justifies regulation, well, at the very least, we could see why it might subsidize or might justify subsidizing innovation. I don't think through direct subsidies. I don't think that makes sense. I don't think they work. But certainly things like technological innovation prizes can be justified on much the same ground that patents can be justified in areas where you don't have the same sort of commons problem. The third principle is that we need to protect and promote property rights. If you want someone to take care of something, one of the best things you can do is give them ownership and stewardship authority over it. We know with the experience of the Endangered Species Act that when you penalize landowners for being good stewards, they stop being good stewards. It should be no surprise that even though the vast majority of species listed as endangered under the ESA rely upon private land, that we don't have a single private land recovery in the 40-year history of the Endangered Species Act. Not one. The only recoveries we can credit to the Endangered Species Act are those that were those for species that rely primarily on government lands, and those are a small fraction of the species that are listed and that we need to save. We need to extend property rights. We need to protect them. We need to recognize property rights and resources like fisheries through things like expanding catch shares, but we also need to recognize them as property rights. Because if you want to maximize the incentives for stewardship, maximize the long-term thinking that we want when it comes to environmental resource, you need to make the stake in that resource something that the owners can rely upon. And there's new research on fisheries showing that when it comes to fisheries, that's exactly what we see. The more secure the property rights are, the more conservation-oriented the fishers who hold those rights behave. They behave in a more conservation-oriented manner. They take the science more seriously. They focus on sustainability more seriously. They, in fact, become more conservation-oriented than the government regulators that are supposed to be ensuring sustainability on the behalf of the rest of us. Fourth principle is that we need to make the polluter pay. And this is actually, I could actually simply just include this in the property rights principle. Because while I think that property rights need to be protected from governmental expropriation, and excessive regulation, property rights also need to be protected against other property owners who misuse their property. It's a principle going back at least 500 years in our legal system that you don't have the right to use your property in the way that harms another, in a way that interferes with the use of a neighboring property owner. That's a principle that was embodied in the common law of nuisance, and if we don't think the common law of nuisance is enough, and I'm not sure it is, then the sorts of regulations we should be those that focus on identifying and punishing actual harms. It shouldn't matter if a company violates its permit if there is no measurable effect on the river into which it's emitting. Yet under current law, that company can face thousands of dollars of fines, and private groups can have standing to sue it, again, even if there is no measurable change in water quality. Yet in many states, if they've complied with their permit, that is a get-out-of-jail-free card when sued by someone downstream or downwind. That is completely backwards. If we care about property rights, if we care about pollution, and I think, again, pollution is a property rights issue, we should focus on making sure that we are holding those people accountable and companies accountable for the way they misuse their land. And when we apply that, say, to an interstate context, it means that, yes, the state of North Carolina should have a cause of action against the Tennessee Valley Authority if the Tennessee Valley Authority is preventing North Carolina from meeting North Carolina's air quality goals. But as we know, under federal law, too bad. Again, that's completely backwards. Washington, D.C. shouldn't be telling North Carolina how clean the air should be. North Carolina should be deciding how clean North Carolina's air should be. And if North Carolina wants to be cleaner than Washington requires, it should be able to achieve that goal. And that relates to my final point. The final principle is that we need to open the states as laboratories of democracy in environmental policy. We need to decentralize environmental decision-making. Most environmental problems are not national. Most are local or in some cases regional. And it doesn't make sense to require one-size-fits-nobody approaches to environmental policy. The air quality problems in North Carolina are different than those in Phoenix. They're different than those in Bozeman, Montana, or in Providence, Rhode Island. We may be talking about the same pollutants. Tropospheric ozone is formed by the same chemical reactions no matter where you are, but the mix of sources, the sorts of policies that will actually achieve results, and the trade-offs that different communities want to make are going to vary from place to place, and we should respect that. If we don't know how to move fully to a pure free market solution, we should at least move in that direction through decentralization. And as North Carolina's own experience shows with the Clean Smokestacks Act that was brought up earlier, and I have no idea if it's cost beneficial or not, but it's evidence that states today, just as states in the 1960s, are willing to advance environmental values that they believe are important and must be protected, and will often do so far beyond what the federal government requires. I see that I'm, I think, over my time, so I'll stop here and just say that if conservatives want to be part of the discussion about what our environmental future is, they have to neither apologize for conservative principles, nor ignore environmental policies and environmental problems. What they need to do is take seriously the task of finding ways of reconciling our need and demand for environmental protection, but with a commitment to things like free enterprise and limited government that conservatives hold dear. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Professor Adler. And our final speaker today is Reed Watson, the Director of Applied Programs and a Research Fellow at the Property and Environment Research Center in Bozeman, Montana. Reed's research is focused on market-based solutions to natural resource conflicts, particularly for water and wildlife. He also directs PERC's Enviropreneur Institute, a 2-week educational program for environmental entrepreneurs. Independent of PERC, Reed consults resource managers, government officials, and conservation organizations on environmental resource valuation and deal structuring. Reed graduated from Duke Law and the Nicholas School in 2008, and because of that, I've come into contact with tons of people that know him and have heard really wonderful things. So we're thrilled to have him back on campus. Reed Watson.
David, thank you for the introduction and the invitation. It's great to be back here at Duke. It wasn't long ago that I was a student here. In fact, I met my wife in an environmental economics course here. But I think this is probably my favorite visit to campus because I didn't have to take out a student loan first. Nick Loris dared me to do an interpretive dance, and he doesn't know me well enough to know that I'll accept. So I'm going to call this Conservative Visions. Cue music. I'm just kidding. All joking aside, I do want everybody, if you would, to humor me and stand up. It's been a pretty long day. I'm going to lead you in a little bit of stretching and blood flow and get some more oxygen to your brain. Okay, everybody kind of stretch, get up. A couple deep breaths. We're going to breathe in through our nose and out through our mouth. A couple deep breaths. Deep when you go in. Okay, how about some arm circles? Okay, head circles around. Shake it out a little bit. Okay, freestyle. If you have a favorite stretch, you can do it now. Okay, that's good. All joking aside, I want to keep everybody awake, and that blood flow does help. Thanks for humoring me. Today's topic is conservative visions of our environmental future. Being the last speaker, I want to leave you with an optimistic vision of our environmental future. But let me state at the outset that my optimism is grounded in conservative principles, specifically that people should pay the full price for the resources they consume and be paid for the valuable resources they produce. Let me restate that people should pay the full price of the resources they consume and be paid for the valuable resources they produce. I think both conservatives and liberals can get behind that principle. So what is my optimistic vision for environmental future? It's that environmental entrepreneurs, or enviropreneurs as we call them at PERC, will solve the world's most pressing environmental conflicts more amicably and at far lower costs than the current top-down, acrimonious, regulation-based breed of environmentalism that dominates today. If, and there's always an if, we remove price-distorting subsidies for water, fuel, foodstuffs, and the other resources that we hope to conserve. Let me spend the next 10 minutes unpacking this assertion. It's a heavy one, and then Jonathan and I will answer questions to close out the day. So first off, what is an enviropreneur, besides a difficult word to spell and pronounce? Bob Inglis already presented you an example. I think his name was Carlos Gutierrez, who innovated a new way to recycle PET, the plastics in our water bottles and milk jugs. An enviropreneur like Carlos is someone who has an entrepreneurial idea and wants to use it to improve environmental quality. Enviropreneurs simultaneously pursue financial and environmental returns, okay? Or as we say, they want to do good while doing well. Whereas most environmentalists see pollution as an externality requiring regulation, environmentalists see use conflicts that can be solved through property rights and contracts. Plain and simple, enviropreneurs are the agents of free market environmentalism, as Jonathan just described it. I'm a storyteller, I like examples, so to elucidate this concept, let me present to you an example of environmental conflict, a simple one you might think, and an enviroprenarial solution that hopefully if you'll listen to me and follow it and try to apply it to the environmental issues that you care about, you'll find it informative. Let me introduce you to my good friend Hank Fisher. He's the order statistic, in my mind, of enviropreneurs. Hank likes gray wolves. Canis lupus. That's Latin. I went to law school. His eyes light up when he talks about them, and in the early 90s, Hank and many others wanted gray wolves reintroduced in Yellowstone National Park. I don't quite know why everybody keeps mentioning Yellowstone, but I live about an hour north of it. The problem was that a lot of other folks didn't want wolves reintroduced into the park. Why? Because gray wolves are completely illiterate. They can't read maps. Oops, my picture's out of whack. That shows the Yellowstone Park boundary in red. My house is just above Hellroaring Creek there, a few miles. In fact, walked the trail behind our place with Jim Salzman a couple months ago. Wolves don't recognize park boundaries. There's not a fence around Yellowstone National Park, and there's a lot of private land actually bordering or very near to Yellowstone National Park. What the people that came out in opposition of wolf reintroduction were scared about was that these wolves would walk right past the Yellowstone Park boundary sign, keep on going, and look for an easy meal. These guys. Livestock, privately owned livestock, okay? This wasn't a hypothetical fear. The wolves had done it before, and indeed it was for this reason that the fathers and the grandfathers of ranchers around Yellowstone had contributed to the wolf's disappearance via what they called acute lead poisoning. So on one side, you've got a ranching community strongly opposed to wolf reintroduction. Okay? They think of wolves in this way, not the cute and cuddly puppies. Got my slides out of whack, excuse me, like this. But when they think of gray wolves, they think of that, livestock eaters. Okay? On the other side, you've got a bunch of environmental organizations pushing very hard for reintroduction. Okay? It's the typical zero-sum environmental conflict where one side's gain is the other's loss. Protests, public comments, the political process is going to declare a winner and a loser, and you'd better call your congressman and make sure that you're not the loser. Okay? Here's some more protesters. So Hank steps back from this and starts thinking about this zero-sum contest and thinks that we can do better. He starts to think like an entrepreneur. He realized that ranchers weren't opposed to reintroduction per se. They didn't hate wolves per se. What they hated, what they were opposed to, was bearing all the financial costs and uncertainty of having wolves in their backyard. Okay? So what did he do? Hank and his organization, the Defenders of Wildlife, took on that financial risk. They took on that uncertainty by promising to compensate ranchers for any wolf predation. Okay? They raised a wolf compensation fund by selling this poster. I think it was $30, and this was in the mid to late 90s, if I recall. So it was real money, $50 now, maybe more. They raised a wolf compensation fund, and anytime a rancher claimed that a wolf had come onto their property and predated their livestock, Hank and a biologist would come out, look around for evidence. If they saw tracks, if they saw wolf hair, they would confirm it as a wolf kill, and they would compensate the rancher the full market price of that lost livestock. Okay? All of a sudden, the fiery opposition became less fiery. The temperature turned down a bit. Why is this a good example? Granted, it's a simple example and one that may not be all that relevant to you here in North Carolina. But it demonstrates enviropreneurship because Hank's program got the folks who wanted wolves reintroduced into the park to pay the cost of wolf reintroduction. Okay? They used a market good, this poster, to capture the demands that those folks had for wolf reintroduction. It was the recognition that there's no such thing as a free lunch, that we shouldn't expect others to pay the cost of our environmental demands. Why can we expect environpreneurs like Hank to solve environmental conflicts? Why should you believe me, in other words? It's not because they're altruistic, benevolent, or all-knowing. It's because they recognize a demand for environmental conservation, and they meet that demand like any entrepreneur would, by creatively thinking about how to produce something that makes some folks richer and no one worse off. Who can be an environpreneur? It's not just for the nonprofit staffers like Hank. It's not just for the for-profit seekers. There's quite a few that have come through our institute. But it can also be bureaucrats who help craft regulations that harness markets to more efficiently achieve conservation outcomes. Now, let me be clear. This is not a true demonstration of free market environmentalism when you've got legislation that has a predetermined outcome. But you can harness markets to achieve that regulatory compliance more cheaply, more effectively, more quickly. Besides conservationists, bureaucrats, and so forth, environpreneurs can also be private landowners who recognize the economic potential of producing environmental goods and services, such as water filtration. An example that's kicked around a lot is New York City's, you might call it a market-based solution to water quality. Google it sometime. It's in the Catskills and it concerns land conservation as opposed to a built water treatment center. Just about the only folks who have historically failed, and in my opinion will, or estimation will continue to fail as environpreneurs, are those who expect the rest of the world to share their environmental value system. Those who expect to consume something without paying for it. Those who expect corporations to forego financial returns for environmental or social returns in what they euphemistically call triple bottom line accounting. These expectations will not generate stable environmental solutions if they generate any at all. Don't believe me? Look at what happened to the budgets of corporate social responsibility departments after the 2008 recession. This raises my call to action and my assertion that enviropreneurs offer more hope than regulatory-based environmentalism. The enviropreneurs, like Hank, respond to price signals in the market. And as Jonathan explained, these price signals convey far more information and more accurate information than any bureaucracy can collect, analyze, or base decisions on. One reading suggestion, if you're skeptical there or want to read more, is I, Pencil by Leonard Reed. It contrasts the ability of individual actors and entrepreneurs to collect information and make decisions and organize inputs with the ability of administrative agencies and bureaucrats. But so long as we have environmental policies that distort those price signals, the ability of enviropreneurs to solve our environmental conflicts will be impaired significantly. Consider the subsidies for automobile fuel or coal-fired power generation that you heard about from earlier speakers today. Those subsidies mask the scarcity of those resources, and they discourage entrepreneurial innovation. We did hear a lot about innovation. Let me be one to suggest policies that could actually help spur innovation. Get rid of the subsidies. If you're concerned about our environmental future, and you share my enthusiasm for enviropreneurs like Hank Fisher, Carlos Gutierrez, then I ask you to consider your own environmental demands and whether you're asking someone else to meet those demands for free. If so, consider whether that's fair. If you think it's fair, consider whether it's a stable solution, whether it's going to provide the sort of outcomes that you want long term. And whether you might actually get more environmental conservation if you paid the producers for what they produce. I don't mean to overstate the case for enviropreneurs, or for that matter, free market environmentalism. Developing property rights for some resources, such as the atmosphere, such as highly migratory fisheries, is hard. It's really hard. But as these and other resources become scarcer, and by that I mean as we fight over them more and more, the benefits of defining property rights, of negotiating conservation deals, and of harnessing the creativity of enviropreneurs will only increase. Let me close with the following, and then we'll do questions. When I studied environmental law, I was taught to examine each issue through a particular law or regulation, and each one has its own fancy acronym. Hazardous waste implicate the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA. Red-cockaded woodpeckers trigger the Endangered Species Act, or the ESA. And pesticide contamination raises issues under my all-time favorite, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA. I challenge all of you in this room, especially you law students, the next time around that you hear or read about pollution or some other environmental controversy, to forget the alphabet soup for momentarily. Don't do this if the next time you hear about environmental controversy is on the environmental law exam. I encourage you to eat the alphabet soup. But if otherwise, consider whether a more durable, amicable solution can be found using what you learned in property law or contracts law. Think about Hank Fisher. Granted, it was a simple example, but I think it elucidates how we can actually develop mutually beneficial voluntary agreements for some of our environmental conflicts. This, I think, is a conservative, market-based approach that many folks can get behind. I want to say thank you to Duke for hosting this important event, and in particular to the Law and Nicholas School students who've worked very hard to make it happen. I applaud you guys. You have a full plate already, and you're taking this on, and I think it's great. These conversations are critically important, and I'm just very happy to be a part of it. So thanks very much. After almost 30 years of existence, we're finally adopting some technology at PERC, my organization. So if anything I said interests you or infuriates you, I encourage you to check out some of our online stuff or give me an email or a call. Thanks very much.
I think the wolves are a good picture to have for our final Q&A session of the day. So we're going to start with a question from Jim Saltzman, a professor at Duke. Jonathan, relying solely on nuisance suits for air and water pollution assumes you can demonstrate causation. When there are multiple sources and complicated airshed and watershed mixing, is it realistic to rely on the common law?
I think that's a very good question. You guys hear I think it's a very real problem. I think there was a time when I thought that, common law would take care of everything. I don't believe that anymore. What I think is important about the common law is not the specific mechanism of using nuisance suits to deal with all pollution problems, but the underlying principles that the common law embodied that I think have been totally lost in existing environmental regulation. The common law nuisance system is based on the idea that we are trying to reconcile potentially competing uses of property rights, and we're concerned about what happens when one individual or entity uses their property in a way that harms someone else or prevents someone else from using theirs in an acceptable way, and then it's a mechanism for resolving that dispute. Existing environmental law not only doesn't embody that principle because concerns about harm are generally absent from the administrative regulatory process, particularly those statutes that rely upon permitting regime. And also completely divorce the property owners from having any say in the disposition of any sort of conflict. So one of the things that was very valuable about the common law, and in those jurisdictions where common law nuisance and trespass suits were used more vigorously to police water pollution than they were in the United States. So for example, in parts of England, the important part wasn't the suits. The important was the clear boundaries that were determined for what was permissible or impermissible use of property and what would constitute an infringement upon, say, a downstream riparian owner's rights, and the ability that created for individuals to bargain and to come up with alternative arrangements outside of court. Now, I don't think the way we get there is simply to snap our fingers, move the regulations, and say, okay, let's have nuisance law and hope these sorts of things evolve. It's to say, how can we make our pollution control regimes, even if they have to be supplemented by regulation, replicate those things about the common law that allowed the sort of discovery and evolution that was valuable in the common law system. The last point I would just make is, and maybe this contrasts with Reed's optimism, I have a really hard time in talking about environmental policy presenting anything as a true solution, because environmental policy is messy, environmental problems are real, and they will never go away. Modern human civilization necessarily involves massive, irreversible, often distasteful effects on the world around us. And if some of us are comfortable with the effects that we have on the world around us, there will be others that are not, right? Because a lot of these questions come down to what our subjective value preferences are, come down to questions of aesthetics or our normative conceptions of what the world should be like, things that can't be resolved by science. And so one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that we're always comparing one set of very imperfect, very inadequate, very unsatisfactory set of institutions with their available alternatives. And so I think the common law is flawed. I think it probably was less able to deal with modern industrial pollution problems than some forms of regulatory, or some forms of regulation or regulation supplementing those sorts of systems. But I think it's a much closer call than we tend to recognize. And if you look at the actual performance of the existing regulatory system that we actually have, I think that becomes clear. And I think we can envision of regulatory systems that would look more like or embody more of the principles of the common law that would do a better job than either the common law as it existed 100 years ago or the regulatory systems we have today.
So just a quick follow-up on the idea of massive, irreversible consequences. I think probably the visceral reaction that a lot of people have against conservative environmentalism or free market environmentalism is that those consequences and then not doing something proactive about it from a centralized way is worrisome. So in the face of massive, irreversible consequences, how does the free market, for things like atmosphere, whether it's climate change or pollution, how does the free market confront these problems?
Well, I mean, the institutional way we deal with what we could characterize as many, many problems that are either caused by many disparate entities contributing to, say, pollutant loading or whatever else, or something that affects many on the other side, and we obviously have some where you have many on both sides, is through aggregation, through institutional arrangements that allow us to aggregate the preferences and interests on those on one or both sides of that equation. And that's something we see throughout the law all the time. I mean, one story that can be told about why we have firms, and we always, in environmental policy, we always talk about cost as the problem of social cost, and then misrepresent it. We forget about is cost as the nature of the firm, which he saw as actually the same paper and the same insight, which is we have institutions that deal with these problems, and in some cases, and I talked about decentralization at the end of my talk, we may need to rely upon things just that we have as our aggregation mechanisms. So rather than individual landowners dealing with the TVA and all the other utilities upwind, letting North Carolina do it. And that sort of aggregation at least reduces the transaction costs and makes it easier. And I have a paper on how to think about climate change in this way as well. I mean, my view, because the way we've aggregated concerns internationally historically, certainly pre-mid-20th century, the classical liberal way of doing it was placing sovereign states in the same position vis-a-vis each other as that landowners would be nationally. And if that's our view of the way the world's supposed to work, well, then why shouldn't Bangladesh have a cause of action, or at least a moral claim against the United States? It's not clear to me why they shouldn't. The challenge I usually make to my conservative and libertarian friends is if they believe that it's wrong for the city of New London to take Suzette Kilo's land for purposes of economic development, why is it okay for the United States to take a poor low-lying farmer in Bangladesh's land for the purposes of economic development? I mean, Suzette Kilo at least got compensated. It's not clear what the landowner in Bangladesh is getting. But we aggregate to deal with that because we know we can't conceive right now of a legal system where that farmer in Bangladesh could sue Exxon, or where an individual landowner in North Carolina could sue TVA. And perhaps when we're talking about things on a watershed basis, we want to talk about how we identify who are those that can, or a mechanism whereby the watershed could be represented, say, by a riverkeeper organization and the like, and how we can create aggregation mechanisms like we see in tort law now, where you perhaps allow for certain types of joint and several liability. I'm not saying any of these are easy, but we've seen similar sorts of problems dealt with through institutions that are more compatible with traditional classical liberal notions of the role of government than the modern regulatory state. And my biggest complaint is that for the last 40 years, 50 years, we stopped asking those questions and stopped looking at those sorts of solutions. And I think if we look at the environmental results we have today, yeah, we had a period of time where we had a decent amount of progress. But I think a lot of folks think it's not nearly as much as we should have or could have. And I would argue that's why we have to reopen the examination of those sorts of alternatives.
Thanks. A few more questions before we're done for the day. This question's from Megan Tressiter, the managing editor of Duke Environmental Law and Policy Forum. And we're going to start with Reed on this one. If we privatize environmental protection or move towards more free market systems, will the government then need to regulate those private organizations?
No. I think the whole point of a market system is a market discipline. So we're not just, it was actually, this is kind of an aside, but a mentor of mine once said, we don't pray to the shovel. You like it because it's good at digging holes. Okay? Markets are the same way. We're not religious zealots here praising markets, but one of the truly beneficial things about markets is the discipline that they force on producers and consumers. They punish inefficiency and waste. And for that reason, if we are serious about trying to adopt market principles or apply them to some measure to environmental issues, I think the point is that we don't have to look over the actor's shoulder, that if they start to slouch and waste and destroy resources and wealth, there'll be a competitor that comes along and does a better job. So I don't think regulation of market-based environmentalism is necessary.
I generally agree with that, although, I mean, the one, I guess, caveat I would make on Reed's comments is you get into somewhat semantic debates about what constitutes regulation, right? So my house is mine, right? It's privately owned. Am I regulated because I can't play loud music at 4 in the morning that my neighbor's going to hear or dump my garbage on his lawn? Well, I think one could say, no, that's not what we mean by regulation. That's just recognition and protection of property rights. I have the right to do things on my land as long as I'm not creating unreasonable disturbances to my neighbors. If we recognize those sorts of boundaries as something other than what we usually mean by regulation, then I agree 100% with what Reed said. If we want to call that regulation, then that's a form of regulation. But I think Reed and I would agree on that point, that the question is whether or not, if by regulation we mean controlling behavior, the question is whether or not we're using market discipline and enforcement of property rights to discipline behavior, or are we using some sort of administrative regulatory system to discipline behavior? And obviously those are kind of the poles. I mean, a lot of cases we may be talking about things in the middle, but if that's the way we're viewing it, then no, we want to, the way behavior should be regulated is not through administrative regulation, but where possible through enforcement of property rights and the discipline of the market.
And the final question is, as free market environmentalists, what do you think the best way then is to internalize costs and correct all the market distortions?
Property rights. I mean, I don't care how smart you are and how big your computer is, I don't think that you know, some of my best friends are economists, but despite that, what I'm about to say is, I'm sorry, you know, when EPA or someone else comes up with the price of carbon, that's a nice number. But the idea that includes everything, especially all the environmental values, which are often a function of subjective value preferences, come on, who are we kidding? The way we can't do this with pure economic goods. What makes us think we can do it in the environmental context? The reason central planning failed in Soviet nations is not because their bureaucrats were bad people. It's not because they were stupid. It's because the calculation necessary was not possible to be done. And if you can't do it with shoes, you're not going to do it with Preble's meadow jumping mouses or vistas or air sheds, because you're not merely dealing with the pure economic variables, you're dealing with all these other environmental variables as well. So if our goal is internalizing the externalities, what we want is property rights in exchange, or to get as close to that as possible. And I should just note as a caveat, you read Coase closely, that's what he's saying, and one of the things he points out is that even if we could calculate the optimal Pigouvian tax, we don't know who to impose it on in any given instance to ensure economic efficiency. And the only way we discover that is through institutions that are robust enough to reveal that sort of information, and the only set of institutions we've ever discovered that can move us in that direction are transferable property rights.
And to that point, this will be brief. The executive director of my organization, Terry Anderson, has declared prohibition on the use of the word externality at our organization, and he forces us. It's partly a semantic and intellectual debate, but partly it's to force us to think about property rights and who owns the property rights and how are they being. Are they unclear? Can an environmentalist define them more clearly? And I think it's a useful lens through which to examine these environmental conflicts, because so often we just assume that there's an externality present, positive or negative. It was discussed many times today. And what we ought to be thinking about is who has the property rights. If we don't like the way something's being managed, or if we think some resources are being wasted, can we acquire property rights over those resources ourselves, as opposed to, oh, there's an externality, we need to go see hire an attorney or go see our representative or administrative agency. Echoing Jonathan's comments on property rights.
And a quick follow-up on that. If the goal is to reduce carbon emissions, what are some ideal free market solutions or free market prescriptions for that?
I'm a fan of the revenue neutral carbon tax, not because I believe it fully internalizes the externality, but because just very simply, I mean, long before I was concerned about climate change as a problem, I understood why you generally don't want to tax wealth creation and labor, and you want to tax consumption, and that some sort of broad-based consumption tax would be preferable. When you add that just basic understanding of what a good economic tax system would look like with the nature of the climate problem, I think the case for revenue neutral carbon tax can be made, even if we just say, gosh, we don't know how big of a problem climate change is going to be. I think, in addition to that, though, I think that because the global atmosphere is a commons, things that we use to encourage innovation, like the patent system, don't work. And I have a paper in Harvard Environmental Law Review for people that are truly interested that walks through this, but basically where in normal markets, you can rely upon the patent system and its reward of super competitive rewards to innovation as a way of encouraging a close to optimal level of innovation, where you have an open access commons, innovations that help protect that commons by reducing its use. There is no ability for the innovator to achieve super competitive returns through the patent system. So it would seem, if the patent system's okay, it seems to me that having technology inducement prizes for commons problems like climate would make sense. And if you look at the hundreds of millions of dollars we spend on applied energy R&D, most of which goes down a sinkhole, it would seem to me a much better use of that money would be endowing technology inducement prizes to help spur the level of innovation that would and will be necessary to mitigate climate change through something other than geoengineering.
I'm going to take a step back from the practical and go back to the theoretical and repeat what I said earlier, which is remove subsidies. I think Jonathan may have a point about the inducement of innovation with patents, but I'm not convinced that that there's not enough smart people thinking about this, that if we could actually spur innovation by reducing some of these price distortions, that we wouldn't actually get the kind of technological innovations that we're after. A simple example, again, kind of from my backyard, is when the pioneers came over the hill, crossed the Mississippi River, Missouri River, and feasted their eyes for the first time on the enormous grasslands of the West. There was plenty to go around. As more and more came over and put more and more cattle on those grasslands, the grass became scarcer, and people said, we got to define property rights to this. Well, if you think about the technology at the time, wooden fences, it would take 3 or 4 generations to fence the West. It's a big place, and these ranches are tens of thousands of acres in some instances. What was the technological innovation that significantly reduced the cost of defining property rights? Anybody? Barbed wire. Pretty simple. We take it for granted now until you walk into one and cut your elbow. But you know, maybe I'm just optimistic and pie in the sky here. But I do think if we start thinking about these commons as you know, it's our challenge today. But we can come up with the new next barbed wire perhaps. But I don't think we're going to do it as long as we're distorting the price of what's contributing to these emissions. So.
Awesome. Thanks so much, guys, and thanks to all of our amazing speakers today. We're going to have very brief concluding remarks, and we'll wrap it up. Thanks.
Thanks.
So we've come full circle, and the people that have stayed this long, you're amazing. And I'm gonna start my ending the same way I began the beginning, to say this. My name is David, and I am a liberal. Today's speakers were all conservatives, so we are starting from different ideological points. But what we saw today is that we have nearly identical visions of the endpoint of our environmental future. Here, traditional subsidies are generally bad, secure property rights are good, we need to spur innovation. Of course, there were debates among the speakers, let alone between the parties. But today, our terrific speakers left bumper sticker land and spoke in inside voices. So we have different starting points, but we have the same destination. We want a positive, sustainable environmental future. Now, let's talk quietly and chase that positive vision. Thank you very much.